Good evening, everyone. I think I know everybody, but in case I don't, my name is Patrick Mason, Chair of the Economics Department, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 9th Annual Samuel Bowles Lecture. And before I get along too far, it's important to thank all the people who made this possible. Patrick Fenton added the event to our department's webpage. Nicole Donham, Sheila Gilroy, Christine Marable also contribute to all the many tasks that are necessary for the production of this lecture. And of course, Mwangi Wagathinji, Associate Chair, coordinated all the activities for the lecture. This lecture began in 2016 with the inaugural lecture by Sam Bowles on the origins and future of inequality. Thereafter, we have had lectures by Manuel Pastor on inequality in the community, Nancy Fulbray on earnings inequality and the care penalty of occupations, Juliet Shore on inequality and the platform economy, as well as lectures by Juan Camilo Cardenas, James Hint, sorry. Having a difficult time speaking, and others. All of the lectures have highlighted issues and problems of great interest to the faculty and graduate students of the UMass Economics Department, a department whose international reputation grew out of the work of Sam Bowles and a remarkable group of economists who arrived here in the 1970s and 80s. Our lecture today will be delivered by Wendy Carlin. She will be introduced by Sam. Although he is officially retired, Sam continues to teach a graduate microeconomic theory course for this department and to do interesting research. In preparation for today's lecture, I decided to take a look at Sam's Google Scholar site. Impressive number of citations, I might add. I found his earliest publications occurred in the mid to late 1960s, a fascinating period in the history of the U.S., when he began to write on education and inequality. That research was continued through the 1970s and summarized in Schooling in Capitalist America. Sam went on to do an enormous volume of high-quality research, focusing on heterogeneous labor and Marxian theory, contested exchange, social structures of accumulation, U.S. productivity growth, pro-social behavior, and many other topics. So, without further ado, present to you Sam Bowles. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. When I was first told of this, it was mentioned to me as the Samuel Bowles Memorial Lecture. And because of that, I've been asked every year to introduce the speaker just to correct the record. I don't think, nothing's ever been named after me except my daughter named her dog after me. And you wonder about what that actually means. So, but anyway, I'm very honored that the department has recognized my work and my contribution to the department's activities over such a long period of time. What a wonderful pleasure and joy it is to welcome Wendy back to the department. She's been here many times. And to give this brief introduction, she told me that she would take stern measures if I went on for more than a couple of sentences. And she will. Wendy is known to many of you as the author of 4 textbooks in macroeconomics. She was a pioneer in what's called the 3-equation model, which has now been widely accepted. The texts that she wrote have integrated what I would call the modern microeconomic aspects of macro into the analysis. And one of the reasons why I appreciate it so much is that Wendy and my work overlaps in many, many areas. One of the things that Wendy has done in recent years is something which I think is truly astounding. She took on the job of transforming how people learn intro to economics around the world. She founded, along with me and a couple of other people, the CORE project, which she has led since its inception 12 or 13 years ago. And much to our surprise and delight, we've been quite successful in some countries, for example, the UK, in fundamentally altering what people study when they study economics. Less successful in the US, but we have some successes lined up for sure in Spain. Wendy and I are just back from China, where there's a lot of interest in our approach to teaching introductory economics and the courses that follow. Somehow she's also found time to do her own research, some early research on transition economies. She was the editor of a journal on that subject. She maintains somehow a research trajectory as well as running this giant global project, CORE. I'm very much anticipating this lecture. I've heard some talk about it. I'm sure it has something, we'll see something of this in the next edition of CORE, because that's the way Wendy works. She does research, and pretty soon it ends up in some intro textbook trying to reach out and transform how people think about economics so that we can jointly around the world transform the world to be a better place, particularly for the least well off. Let's hear it for Wendy and welcome her to our department.
Thank you very much, Sam. It's lovely to be here, and I'm very honoured to be invited to give this lecture. It's it's a tremendous honour. So let me mention when I think this was when I was last here actually, 14 years ago, almost exactly. I think it was November. For the inauguration of the Andrew Glynn chair in the department. That was a very moving occasion for me and my family. And that visit sparked a conversation with Sam the following year in Siena, and that led in 2013 to the creation of the CORE project. So that's what Sam was referring to. So in some ways, it kind of all started here. At UMass with that lecture. And as Sam mentioned, there's sort of some kind of symmetry, and that formed very much the part of our initial conversation about CORE, which was between what he does in micro and what I do in macro, and there was some sort of idea that these things could be brought together. So that's what I'm going to talk about this evening. Some of the things in my macro book. You can see that Sam and I also have like a lively competitive spirit in the design of covers of books. So you can decide who you think wins out. And we've also done, you'll see quite a bit of our research collaboration, as well as a whole number of things that have gone into the CORE project. So let me begin by setting out what I hope to do. So what I want to do is to kind of sketch out a five-part argument where I'm going to begin with, so it's going to be kind of like a historical story, and I'm going to argue that for the roughly 2 decades from 1948, there was a new and a unified paradigm in economics, which had a name, the Keynes-Samuelson neoclassical synthesis of micro and macro. Then I'm going to kind of have 3 parts of the argument that are going to center about the year 1970. So the argument, the first line of argument is that post-Walrasian theory came to dominate research in micro. That at the same time in macro, what I will call the Walrasian detour began, creating a great divergence between what was happening in research in micro and macro. But the third part of that, of what happened in that period, was that faced with what was going on in the world, and you'll see that I'm going to kind of interleave what was happening in the world with what was happening in economics research throughout the talk. And in that period, faced with stagflation, some theorists, actually mainly micro-theorists and Marxists, whatever they were, micro or macro, tackled macro questions of unemployment and inflation using post-Walrasian theory. So that's the kind of three parts of the story around the 1970s and into the 1980s. And then the final part is that I'm going to suggest that after the financial crisis, then even the macros out there on their Walrasian detour couldn't forever ignore inequality, and that this was the origins of what we now call heterogeneous agent macro, or the Hank models in macro. And I want to suggest, in a very optimistic spirit, and we need plenty of it these days, that there might be happening the basis of a new synthesis of micro and macro, what we could think of as a unified post-Walrasian economics, fit for addressing inequality and many of the other pressing problems that we face. So that's the kind of spirit in which I'm going to invite you to join me on this journey for the next 50, 60 minutes or so. But if you get bored, I can stop at any time. And what I'm going to use is just a kind of a scaffolding to hang the argument on, is Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions. He has a very nice language where he talks about paradigms, and he says that the study of paradigms is what mainly prepares the student for membership in the particular scientific community with which he or she will later practice. So that's the sense in which I'm going to use the notion of a paradigm. And you'll see that threaded through the talk is this connection between what's going on in research and what's going on in the classroom. And I think for both Sam and me, that's kind of been part of our lives as economists. He said as well that the scientific community's paradigms are revealed in its textbook, so exactly that. And so, all of this effort on textbooks is somehow validated in Kuhn's idea about a paradigm. It's revealed in its textbooks, lectures, and lab exercises, or for us, problem sets. And by studying them and practicing them, the members of the corresponding community learn their trade. He went on to say that normal science would prevail as long as the tools a paradigm supplies continues to prove capable of solving the problems it defines. Science moves fastest and penetrates most deeply through confident deployment of those tools. Retooling is an extravagance to be reserved for the occasion that demands it. So somehow it's really quite hard to shift a paradigm, and that would be part of the story. A paradigm switch, he says, the active judgment that leads scientists to reject a previously accepted theory is always based on more than a comparison of that theory with the world. The decision to reject a paradigm is always simultaneously a decision to accept another, involving the comparison of both paradigms with nature and with each other. So it's no good just having a crisis out there that confronts the existing paradigm. There has to be something to step into its place. So what I'm going to ask is whether the stage is set for if you like, a new paradigm for a unified post-Walrasian economics. And the broad shape of the argument is that microeconomics was profoundly affected by the information and behavioral revolutions that began over 50 years ago. But only since the Great Recession has macroeconomics research, and I'll kind of define this by the top journals, so very conservatively defined, has it confronted the implications of this fact. Although, as I'll show as well, it was drawn to their attention by Arrow in 1967 in his review of Samuelson's collected works. So let's see how this all pans out. I'm going to return, when I talk about macro, to the following kind of structures of what we would think of as a macro model, a business cycle version of macro, the demand side, so how large the multipliers is going to play a role, the supply side. What determines the conflict between owners and workers in wage setting? How does that affect unemployment and inflation? Thirdly, what are the policymakers' objectives? What's the policymaker trying to do? And how are expectations of prices and inflation formed? Bringing us right up to the present, this is a picture of, you can see that I've taken another leaf out of Sam's book, which is that economics is about the people that make it. So we have to kind of have them as part of the story as well. So this is Ben Moll. He's a leading macro researcher. And in his lecture last year, so the Economic Journal lecture at the Royal Economic Society Conference is a kind of big named lecture. He called it The Trouble with Rational Expectations in Heterogeneous Agent Models. Right? So what's wrong with rational expectations in those models? And he quoted from and translated from Oscar Morgenstern's words in 1935. Morgenstern said, "The necessity that with perfect foresight, each individual must grasp all economic interrelations, that is, master economic theory, leads to a scientifically and logically curious fact. If perfect foresight were an indispensable condition for formulating general equilibrium theory," this is 1935, it would result in the further paradox that science is already presupposed in the very object it is meant to investigate. In physics or chemistry, there is no assumption, for example, that atoms need to make assumptions about the behavior and states of other atoms. So this is really a long, long time ago that Morgenstern was talking about perfect foresight. In this talk, I'm going to use some methods, and this comes out of research that Sam and I have done. We began this project at the Santa Fe Institute in 2018, and we wanted to use machine learning to try to get the data to speak its own story about the path of economic research since the beginning of the last century. And this project has resulted in several outputs. So the Journal of Economic Literature paper in 2021, we talked about what the path of research since 1900 and also of introductory textbooks. Then in an economics letters paper from this year, and next year coming out in an essay in the Annual Review of Economics, we talk about research themes, talking about the state, the market, and civil society. And then there's another chunk of work. So this is like you find a tool and you crank it out to help you with many different questions that you want to answer. And this is on topics present in research and intermediate textbooks. And I'm going to refer to each of these projects in the talk. And we've worked with Sahana Subramanian, who's now at Stanford, and with Simon Halliday on this. So what we did was to take these 7 journals, the full text, the entire text of every article in this corpus of work, so about 27,500 articles, distributed over time, as you can see here, and that gave us nearly 11,000 unique parts of words, or bits that we would then use to process processing the text. I'll explain it. Let's just forget it. So what we did was we've used a topic model, and this is a Bayesian machine learning answer to the question of what's the hidden structure of themes that the authors most probably had in mind when they generated the documents. And the easiest way to explain this is just to say what we wanted to do was to ask this model to produce the 100 topics that with highest probability wrote the articles in the corpus. Okay? So you could say, why 100 topics? The answer is, why not? It's just kind of a good number. And it has a sort of relationship to the number of gel codes. So it's sort of at that level of coarseness. We just use each article as a bag of words. There's no sentiment analysis. The order of the words means nothing. It's just a bag of words. We get from the co-occurrences of the words in the articles, we get our topics. And the topic is just a vector of weighted tokens. And here, this is an example of topic 4. So the most heavily weighted word in that topic is quality, then car, merger, attribute, vehicle. So if you saw a string of words like that, and a word cloud like this, then like us, Sam and me, you would probably have said, let's give that the name adverse selection. So that's how this process worked. Right? Throw all the bags of words into the machine learning, and out come 100 topics, and we then give names to the topics. And you can see here the articles in the corpus that are most heavily weighted in this particular topic, topic 4. This is another way of looking at what we did. So this is Lucas's famous 1975 article on the business cycle, and you can see that the topic that had the highest weight in that article was the topic on theorem making, and you can see what makes up that topic: equilibrium solution, and so on, at the top right. Okay, so this is, and then growth models, economic methodology, business cycles. Seems a kind of reasonable interpretation of, for a machine, of Lucas's article. So I'm going to use, there isn't by any chance any water, is there? I should have brought some. Thanks. Okay, so having told you the method, I'm going to get on and use it, and begin at with the first period from 1948. So in 1948, there was a new paradigm unifying micro and macro, known as the Keynes-Samuelson neoclassical synthesis. I think everyone in the room at some point in time came across this. It emerged from a problem that the old theory couldn't address, namely the persistence of unemployment in the Great Depression. We then have new theory. The theory is assembled by Samuelson into a new textbook, completely revolutionary table of contents with the determination of national income pushed right to the front of the book, and at the back of the book, that price and value theory with supply and demand not appearing until chapter 19, right at the back of the book, with only 10 pages devoted to supply and demand. All the attention was on bringing the new theory that, thank you so much, that was developed to address the new problem, and the new textbook had to implement it. So that's the Keynes-Samuelson synthesis. In a nutshell, it explains equilibria with underemployed resources and excess supplies. And the point about the synthesis is that it reduces to the classical or Walrasian general equilibrium theory when resources are fully employed. Or as Samuelson put it, where the classical verities of price and value theory are restored. And what it did, and as we learnt it in our macro courses, it rationalizes light-handed fiscal and monetary interventions that rely only on aggregate data. Remember the capital letters, C plus I plus G, right? And are separate from policies that redistribute income and wealth. It meets Kuhn's criterion. The decision to reject a paradigm is simultaneously a decision to accept another. So that's meeting his criterion. And his second, it was widely adopted by policymakers and taught to undergrads. So that was the Keynes-Samuelson paradigm. Let me move swiftly to kind of marry that with the topic modeling exercise that we did. And so what we did was to take that 100 topics and then make a selection of them that had to do with macro, and we put them into three buckets. Okay, one was aggregate demand, monetary and policy, monetary and fiscal policy, economic growth, and the supply side. And then the great excitement of doing this kind of work is you have absolutely no idea what you're going to get until you press the button. So the question is, this is the metatopic 0, aggregate demand at the top. Here's economic growth and intertemporal optimization. Here's the supply side. And the question is, for you, you've got this triangle. Where does the research trajectory start from that corpus of all the articles published since 1900, and where does it proceed over that period? Okay, so you have a kind of mental map. Does anyone want to become interactive? No. Okay. Well, I'll just show you. Right. So here is where it started. Then that's the movement towards research, moving towards the aggregate demand pole. That's the Keynes-related theory that was being published. And then thereafter, it moves swiftly down towards the growth pole, right? So this was 55 to 69, 70 to 84, and then some movement over more towards supply side topics at the end of the period. So the question is why? Why did research turn increasingly towards growth? One possible explanation is the influence of the Cold War, decolonization, the threat of communism. The real question that was explicitly being asked was, what were the determinants of growth in a decentralized economy without central planning? So that was the context in which economic research moved towards the growth pole, and development economics became very prominent as well. And we've got ex post evidence that suggests that the system's competition to deliver growth was a legitimate concern, and this was work that I did some years ago. But what we did was to compare. So look at the countries, look at the first treatment with communism in 1913. There was another one in 1937. Take all the countries that were treated with communism and find all the other countries at their same level of GDP per capita, and then follow them through to 1988. And what do you observe? You observe that if you were poor and you got communism, this is the red line, you did better than if you were poor and didn't get it by 1988. Okay? On the other hand, if you had already industrialized and you got communism, then you did worse than if you didn't get it. So hence the title, Soviet Power plus Electrification produced the long-run legacy of communism. But let's turn to what those three things that I said happened when we got down towards that pole in macro. What was going on in micro? So we do exactly the same exercise. We put micro theory, all the research in micro, into three buckets. This is market structure and competition, individual optimization, expected utility, and strategic interaction and incomplete information. These are the word clouds for each of the topics. And we ask exactly the same question about how did the research trajectory move over time. So again, you can see this move up to the Marshallian pole, okay, the early part of the last century, then a movement down towards individual optimization and expected utility, and then a very marked shift towards strategic interaction and incomplete information after 1970, right? So we have now you won't have a test, but you've got in your head the way that macro and micro moved over this period. And it's pretty clear what was going on in micro from the 1970s, a shift from mathematizing Marshall to the game theory, behavioral and information revolutions, very familiar to everyone. The introduction of principal agent models where there's a conflict of interest. There's not only incomplete information and incomplete contracts, but there's also inequality. So when micro took this post-Walrasian direction, it necessarily brought with it the tools with which to study inequality and the exercise of power. It also turns out to be the case that what was going on in micro was also affected by what was going on in the world, namely the Cold War. And Sam actually dug up this documentation of this massive Ford Foundation project that ran from 1950 until it was abandoned in 1968. But it was huge in terms of today's money. $1 billion was given to economics, and what were they supposed to do? What were economists supposed to do with all this money? They were supposed to connect effectively with real problems, right? So the Cold War in the background was really influencing the behavior of a massive foundation to try and change the deployment of economists' effort. So this is when all of these theorists began tackling policy problems that could not be addressed with general equilibrium theory. And a really good example of this is Arrow's 1963 paper, where this was sponsored by the Ford Foundation, and it was one of the first kind of theory papers that came out of all of this money. And he very explicitly says that he took the case of health, and it was all about how information problems meant that it was impossible to use Walrasian general equilibrium theory to make progress with understanding the economics of healthcare. So he says here, the logic and limitations of ideal competitive behavior under uncertainty and lack of information force us to recognize the incomplete description of reality supplied by the impersonal price system. And it's all about why we have to take seriously as economists non-market interactions, personal interactions. This was also the time of Johnson's War on Poverty, and it brought a further set of problems into the remit of microeconomists and microtheorists. And it's summed up by Roger Backhouse and Beatrice Cherrier, where they say, from health to education, international relations, political behavior and law, family, marriage, crime, discrimination, prostitution, and drug dealing. All of this came within the scope of economics in the wake of the information and behavioral revolutions, as well as the empirical revolution and the availability of new data. So from the 1970s, economists took on the role of public experts. So in a way, the Ford Foundation, may have been a little too pessimistic about economics. Sam and I have done more work on this recently, where we've tried to kind of codify the change in topics that economists started doing work on from the 1970s. And we focus on, as you can see, this is a talk of triangles. So now we divide up the topics into the state, the market, and civil society, and everything I've said so far is going to lead you to understand why, looking at the bulk of economic research from the end of the 1960s, right, thinking of what Arrow was doing as a kind of leading theorist, was pointing towards a much greater weight of economic research on civil society topics. This was the move towards civil society was very much dominated by the two threads, post-Walrasian micro-theory plus the empirical revolution in macro and micro. Okay, so let's get back to macro and the Walrasian detour. Okay, so let me try and persuade you that, or connect what was happening in micro and macro. And we get back to Arrow, and this I think is really quite remarkable. I mean, Arrow was a truly remarkable economist. And look what he said here. He was really scathing in his review of Samuelson's collected works. I mean, he had a lot of praise for Samuelson, but he was not a fan of the neoclassical synthesis. So recall that it states that with the achievement of full employment, that, which of course requires Keynesian intervention, but once you've done that, then you get back to the Walrasian general equilibrium, right? That is the neoclassical synthesis. So look at what he says. He says, if the underlying element in a K model, so a Keynes model, is a price rigidity of some sort, appropriate government spending or taxation may indeed create full employment, right? But then he says, only if it is assumed that the price rigidity will somehow soften in the beneficent sun of prolonged full employment can one derive neoclassical Walrasian results in the long run. So this is kind of a really powerful insight, bringing together where he'd got to as a micro theorist, and then as doing applied theory in the case of health, for example, and it put him in this kind of, I think, amazing position where he could kind of look at the neoclassical synthesis and say, no, this is not right from a theory point of view. But this did not prompt a post-Walrasian turn in macro research. It wasn't Arrow's kind of highfalutin, if you like, theoretical critique of the Keynes-Samuelson synthesis that activated and energized macros at the time. No, it wasn't that. It was the practical failure of the Keynes-Samuelson policy models in the wake of the, if you like, the end of the golden age and the problems that emerged in the macroeconomy, stagflation, slowing productivity growth, and so on, at the end of the 1960s. And what came with that was the power of the Lucas critique. So that was the major critique about the practical failure of the large-scale Keynesian policy models, and the kind of dominating influence in this Walrasian detour, which has lasted almost till today. And Peter and I had an interesting discussion about this at lunchtime. The expectations of the representative agent must be model consistent. So this is a sort of game theory informed or Nash response to the Keynes Samuelson synthesis and its practical failures. So let me just suggest that there were two quite distinct parts to the Walrasian detour. Two responses, if you like, to the theoretical incoherence of the Keynes-Samuelson synthesis. So there's one lot who, in some senses, you could say, kind of understood there was a problem, a theory problem with the Keynes-Samuelson synthesis, not just the policy failures of the model. So their response was, drop Keynes's theory of income determination. So drop the Keynes part. And just forget demand-efficient driven business cycles. right? So that was their way of kind of reconciling with the theoretical incoherence. And that's what produced the real business cycle theory, or the new classical Walrasian macro. There was a second group who didn't recognize, really, I think, the theoretical incoherence. They stayed with the spirit of the Keynes-Samuelson synthesis because they really wanted a model of the business cycle that had something to do with reality, where there were clearly demand-driven business cycles. So they had to add something to the real business cycle model to generate that. And that was the genesis of the representative agent New Keynesian DSGE models. And both of them agreed with Lucas, who said in his 2003 presidential address, and this is interesting, I think, because what he said was, for individual behavior and welfare, heterogeneity or inequality is everything. For determining the behavior of aggregates, household heterogeneity, inequality, just does not matter very much, right? So they were all for heterogeneous agent models, if you like, but they didn't believe they were of macro consequence, and that's what's changed. So let me we can just check back on Keynes. The Samuelson's book was radical, but neither the post-Walrasian micro nor the Walrasian detour in macro took hold of the textbooks. So in that sense, there was not a kind of Kuhnian paradigm change at this point. This is just summarizing where we've got to, which I won't go through again. I just want to highlight one thing, which is this absolutely crucial feature of the Walrasian detour. And why I want to highlight it is because that's what's become unraveled now in research macro. So this was that everything to do with the causes and transmission of the business cycle, whether it was a productivity generated real business cycle or a new Keynesian kind of real business cycle, everything works through the intertemporal balancing of the Euler equation. Everything is about consumption smoothing, right? That's how everything works in those models at heart. So I'll just let you read this. I was once actually sitting in the audience here, like listening to a talk at a conference, and the famous Hungarian economist János Kornai was sitting next to me, and he said, "Oh, it's just shocking. You go to conferences and lectures and these days, and people treat you as though you can't read." So the question here, and this time there has to be audience participation, the question here is, who wrote this and when? Okay, you just have to have a guess. Come on, someone has to have a go. Koletsky, when? Koletsky, okay, that's good. You've given us a suggestion. Anyone else got a suggestion? Bob Rothorn? Yeah? Sorry? Tom Weisskopf? Okay, I asked this question on the top floor of the Financial Times building in the city in London to a room full of, CEO types, anyway. A very posh affair. And I put this up, and the first suggestion there was not Koletsky, it was Marx. Okay, so you're all wrong. This is the answer. okay? This is page 1 of the Bundesbank annual report in 1973. So who knows when Bob Rothon's article was published? Conflict, Inflation and Money. 77.
Bob got it from the Bundesbank.
Yeah. But this is amazing, right? Okay, so that leads me into the third bit of this kind of interregnum. The end of the golden age, problems are out there in the world, stagflation. And this was the moment at which post-Walrasian micro-theorists, and Marxists in brackets, tackle macro questions of unemployment and inflation. So I'm going to suggest that new models of equilibrium unemployment were based on the strategic interaction between employers and workers in wage setting, with or without a nod to Koleski or Marx, or to the Bundesbank, we now know, using principal agent models and other regarding preferences to supply the micro foundations. So I think we know the basis of all these models, so I won't go through it, but just to remind you of why this matters for a macro model. So on the demand side, principal agent models of the credit market give you credit rationing from the beginning, so you have substantial multipliers. All right, so that's number one, and you also have the basis for the collateral channel operating as the basis for financial cycles. On the supply side, we have principal agent models of wage setting, along with norms and the exercise of power within the firm. Okay, I told you I'd give you photos. So this is, I think, such a wonderful photo of Janet Yellen. And this is an absolutely wonderful article. So everyone should read it. It's 5 pages. And it's a brilliant summary of, in 1984, of the state of these post-Walrasian models of unemployment. And you can see two articles of or papers of Sam's I've highlighted there. So this is an early one, 81. But look, Stiglitz was writing about these things in development economics even earlier. So this is kind of a gold mine. In her thing, she distinguishes, in her article, Janet distinguishes between models with neoclassical agents. Of course, that's the kind of agent Sam likes to have in some of his models. So that's the first type, and then the second type are models with sociological microfoundations, like Akerlof's partial gift exchange model. So there are these, there's a whole variety of, so it's an incredibly creative period just around there then of the early 1980s, as these economists were trying to deal with the problem out there and to understand and explain the persistence of equilibrium unemployment. So in other words, it was unemployment not demand determined. And then we've already had Bob Rothon mentioned, so he created the complementary model of a conflict-based model of inflation and unemployment. Again, as I can tell most of you know, this is an absolutely brilliant article. And as I said, he was echoing the Bundesbank. And this was the time, this was the era of really ugly book covers. And I never let them design a book cover again. So this was the time when David Soskis and I were giving lectures to PPE students in Oxford, using or building up a way of applying these new models, these post-Walrasian models of inflation and unemployment, in a way that undergraduates could cope with. And meanwhile, sort of referring back to Kuhn, the best-selling intermediate macro textbook stuck to the Keynes-Samuelson neoclassical synthesis all through this period of really fertile and modelling in appropriate to the circumstances. So this is what the model looks like. I will not bore you with it now, but just to remind you. And then just get to the final lap of what I want to talk about, which is to suggest that in the wake of the financial crisis, so again, you know, dramatic drama in the real economy, there's finally movement in research macro taking this on board. After the Great Moderation, during which macroeconomics in research, but also in central banks, was extraordinarily complacent and very happy because economies were beautifully hitting inflation targets and unemployment was low. But they finally realized that, in a backward-looking way, that what had been going on was that after the dot-com collapse at the beginning of the 2000s, then in order to sustain aggregate demand, keep it high enough to meet the inflation target, that's when the Fed got involved in encouraging risk-taking by banks, and that was the story we now are very familiar with. And I think this chart really captures why, I mean, even if you were really doggedly sticking to your view about inequality not mattering at the aggregate level and having never mattered, and you were really wedded to the real business cycle and new Keynesian DSG models. I mean, you know, eventually you think at some stage you would start to wonder that maybe you should revisit your priors and think about a model that could cope with the causes and the aftermath of the financial crisis. The new Keynesian, these representative agent models were absolutely dominant in central bank research departments in this period. But as I said, you know, even to those people, and particularly actually because central banks have to make decisions in the wake of what's going on in the world, the irrelevance of the so-called direct channel from aggregate demand shocks and policy to the output gap via intertemporal substitution was evident. I mean, eventually everyone had to kind of acknowledge that, you know, this was just not a good explanation. So I would argue that the new Hank models, the heterogeneous agent models, bring back together the two strands of what had formed the Volresian detour, the split in the 1970s. The Hank models produce very different answers on each of these elements. The demand side, you get back to having substantial multipliers. The policymaker really changes the simple message coming out of the new Keynesian models that you can separate monetary and fiscal policy, and inflation targeting will be welfare. It will be not only stabilizing, but will be the optimal policy, and will return to expectations. So this is, everyone knows, who's ever looked at the data, that the marginal propensity to consume really is different across the income distribution. And very interestingly, we're talking about Kalecki. Sargent, when discussing the Hank models, refers to Kalecki's two-class model. This is the real turning point Hank model of 2018. You've seen the picture of Ben Moll. It has two distinct types of households with high marginal propensity to consume. One are the hand-to-mouth low-income ones, but then there are the wealthy hand-to-mouth that have that own houses but are credit constrained. So they have high MPCs as well, and that's what produces the high multipliers. And there's now just a ton of research, empirical and Hank models that aligns with this. So it then becomes you could say we're sort of back to the mechanisms in the familiar old Keynes-Samuelson synthesis, where it's changes in employment and income, and now as well in asset prices that drive cycles. It's really not to do with consumption smoothing. Thomas Sargent's role in all of this is interesting. He was one of the architects of the new classical macro, of the real business cycle strand of the Walrasian detour. But this is his diagnosis, that it's collapsed, that macro policy has to be thought of completely differently once we recognise the role of heterogeneity and inequality. And that there's now a new policy trade-off because the gains from stabilisation arise from the additional insurance provided at the cost of price stability. So once you take heterogeneity seriously, you cannot separate inequality from macroeconomic stabilisation. And of course that forces back together monetary and fiscal policy, right? You can't just delegate stabilisation to the central bank anymore. As soon as you get into Hank, Ricardian equivalence fails because there are credit constraints, and so monetary policy affects distribution with fiscal consequences. We're back to a very old question about policy assignment. It seems so beautifully simple under the new Keynesian DSG structure, where you could just assign monetary policy to the central bank. There's now a debate about whether the mandate of monetary policy should extend to inequality, which I don't think so, but we can discuss it. What should the remit now be? What should the monetary policy maker and the fiscal policy maker be doing? Its stabilisation role is certainly diminished in welfare terms, right? Because that comes firmly back on the desk of fiscal policy or redistributive policies, or it's better to say insurance policies than redistributive policies. The monetary policy presumably should continue to be responsible for the nominal anchor, and if so, then it requires output stabilisation if it's going to ensure that the nominal anchor actually remains credible, and it also has to maintain fiscal stability. Fiscal policy becomes much more important for welfare stabilisation. So, in the olden days, people used to learn about the automatic stabilisers. They're now back on the table. And countries with a small state, like this one, have weak automatic stabilisers. So that's bad in welfare terms in this Hank world, because there's much less insurance coming through the automatic stabilisers. And I think I've already said that. Yeah, it's insurance, not price level stability, that's the main source of welfare gain from stabilisation. I think what's interesting and exciting, and all of this I think is the basis for good research questions, that there's scope now under the umbrella of mainstream macro research for the use of non-monetary policy instruments to manage inflation dynamics. So if there's a terms of trade shock, then the use of temporary tax cuts or a targeted subsidy to households, these are now back on the table legitimately, right? It's not some kind of weird policy that someone in some weird place thinks up. This is now back on the table. And similarly, in terms of price gouging by firms, the use of price caps and competition policy comes back within the remit of macro policy. And Hank also signals the end of the stranglehold of the rational expectations hypothesis in business cycle macro. we know that this is how it worked before. It was just absolutely unacceptable in macro to have any model that didn't have rational expectations built into it. And if there are a problem, you just tacked on some ad hoc frictions and persistence. But the new research suggests that rational expectations is completely inconsistent, incompatible with Hank models. And the reason is that agents must forecast, and this is the echo back to that Morgenstern quote, agents must forecast the cross-sectional distributions of income and wealth, making it computationally infeasible and ridiculous as an assumption in the model. So if we get rid of rational expectations, then to replace it, we have to face up to the impossibility of agents themselves accessing the rational expectations solution. So that's kind of like now a principle in this forward-looking heterogeneous agent literature. Secondly, any new model of expectations has to respect realism, consistency with empirical evidence, which documents a lot of heterogeneity of beliefs, as compared with what Sargent calls the communism of rational expectations. But still, there has to be some respecting of the Lucas critique, as we would expect. I mean, anyone who thinks in a kind of Nash equilibrium way, we can't give up Lucas altogether. So price beliefs should respond to policy changes. So there's some sort of minimum requirement in there. Okay, final point I'm going to make, because I've definitely exhausted your patience. But I wanted to connect with Aaron's work and with what we've been doing in the core project. Because what's really missing from Hank so far, I've told you they dealt with aggregate demand, they've got credit constraints back in there, proper multipliers, they've got a really serious and interesting discussion about what policymakers should do, and they've grasped the nettle on rational expectations. But they don't really seem to have made much progress on the supply side, or with that 1973 Bundesbank representation of how the economy works. And what in this paper for the JEL, happening? Yeah, good. What they say is that incorporating the fairness and labour discipline ingredients of efficiency wage models with monopsony could perhaps deliver a model with nominal wage rigidity and involuntary unemployment coexisting with monopsony. And guess what? It even has a name. I think it's really, this is a loser, right? You're not going to get anywhere calling this model monergamy, right? It sounds like some kind of marital discord. But anyway, the point about it is that this, by combining a search and matching model about how you get how you get people to turn up with a labour discipline model, which is how you get them to actually work at work, then some of the puzzles of the post-COVID changes in the labour market can perhaps be unravelled. And Aaron and his co-authors credit CORE with developing the micro-foundations of this model in our recently published The Economy 2.0, Unit 6, which you can see the link there. And all you have to do is go onto the CORE website, www.coreecon.org, go to The Economy 2.0, Microeconomics and Unit 6, and you'll find the model, a model you can use in your first year classroom to teach a combined search and matching and labour discipline model of the labour market, which I think Juan Camilo can attest to, that this really works with real life students. And these are the pictures that are built up there. Okay, the second element is the putting that together with the inflation model, and the Lorenzoni and Verning is a version of this. that came out in 2023 in a working paper. It's a Rowthorne and I think Scott-inspired model. Verning is very interested in Koleski. So you know, the macros out there are beginning to work on these models, and we may get to, this is how it works in a very simple way, which I won't bore you with. So I hope I've persuaded you that perhaps, possibly, the stage is set for a new micro-macro synthesis on post-Volrasian microfoundations. We've already made progress, they've already made progress, not me, in the Hank models. We should be able to bring the conflicts of interest models of the supply side into the Hank framework. It's fully coherent with it. We have a more complex macro policy assignment, and we can drop rational expectations. And there's now a lot of discussion about insights that may come from agent-based modeling, for example, by these very people. So when I was here last, all those years ago, Don Katzner kindly gave me a copy of this fantastic book, which is really all about changing economics from the outside. And this talk has done the opposite. So I've tried to talk really about how economics has changed from the inside, especially using this very conservative corpus of research just from those 7 journals. And I've emphasized the role of Arrow, of Sam among Ekelov, Stiglitz, Yellen, and so on. The Young Turks, who are, I think they quite like the idea this might be a revolution, and someone from the old guard, Tom Sargent, who is kind of pushing them along. So that's it, and thank you for your attention.
Wendy, you can call on questions, right?
Sorry?
You can call on questions.
Yeah, I think I can just about manage. Yeah, of course. Yes, so questions? Comments? Yes.
First, an announcement. There is a reception after this, so don't run away straight away. There's a reception downstairs after this. Thanks so much, Wendy. Mine is a very simple one. I'd like you to talk a little bit about how do you see kind of the general literature on inclusive growth fitting into your schema of how macro is changing.
And by inclusive growth, you're thinking of?
I'm thinking of generally the kind of numerous articles we see claiming that, that we need to have inclusive growth.
Yeah.
We don't have any very specific theory.
Yeah, sure. So I think the answer to that is that so if we're thinking, we can, just setting aside kind of long run growth for the moment and thinking more within the sort of business cycle time span, then with these kind of models, there's a distinct concern with inequality, and in that sense with inclusive growth. There's a lot of work now being done using this kind of framework to think about, for example, wealth taxation, and how wealth taxation may or may not contribute to growth, right? So it may contribute some redistributive element, but there are now some pretty good papers that suggest it may also be, as well as redistributive, it may also be contributing to dynamism. So I think that if we're thinking of kind of one way to put it is to think about PhD students and the kind of topics that they're able to choose to work on. And I would say for a very long time that if you wanted to do macro and you weren't here, if you were in a standard economics department around the world, you simply couldn't ask a question like that. You'd be told to go off to development. So I think in that sense, it is a sort of optimistic message. And if you look at, I've just read, 50, I'm shortlisting for postdocs, and I've read lots and lots of papers, and they all had to be do with inequality because it's postdoc in the Stone Center, and many of them were macro papers of the kind that you're suggesting. And I don't believe that would have been possible because they would not have been supervised and they were mainly from elite departments. They would not have been supervised on these topics even 10 years ago. So I think that's a real sea change for the good. One who knows.
So the core chapter 1 starts with the 1,000 years of history, showing how material well-being skyrocketed, but it also created climate change. And that's it right there at the front of the chart. So how is that idea that, in a way similar to Mwangi's question on of inclusive growth, I'm asking about feasible growth.
Yep.
In the sense that the planetary boundaries are going to put some kind of constraint.
Yep.
And is this new microsynthesis
Doing it.
a good idea for putting the cap that there are planetary boundaries that will cap the possibility of using nature, putting fossil carbon into the atmosphere, and so on?
It's certainly a question that is being asked. So I guess I read 2 or 3 papers on that. I don't think it's very convincing yet. Again, this is something Peter and I talked about at lunchtime. The macro models of climate are not very impressive. So I mean, I think that a good thing that could come out of this is there's a lot of firepower going into these kind of models, and they're attracting a lot of good students, and a lot of those students really care about these questions. So to the extent that student curiosity plus technique, if you like, matters in terms of making progress, then there's some chance. But I haven't really seen anything that I find really compelling. But if I do, I'll make sure you get it. Peter.
You're much more optimistic than I am about current developments in macro. I hope you're right. But looking at where it is at the moment, I'm wondering, in what ways do you think that the current Hank models represent any kind of improvement over an ISLN model from early 1970s or late 1970s?
I think they've been
rediscovered a lot of the multipliers. They've rediscovered fiscal policy. They've rediscovered that not all transferable taxes have the same effects on aggregate demand. All of that is good, but there's nothing new there. So the question is, what does it add? Are current PhD students better off building on Kaplan, Mole, and Violanda than they would be from being told, go back and take an old-fashioned model, get rid of the traditional LN curve and have a Taylor rule, but that's actually what many post-Keynesians, even Keynes, sort of suggested way back. But aside from that, would they be better off building on Kaplan, or would they be better off building on the IS7?
I think, well, forget the LMs, that's irrelevant. I think, the models that are in here are exactly what you're talking about. They are tractable models, replacements for ISLM, right? For contemporary institutions. And so I don't see any conflict, right? I mean, the fact is you can do a lot with simple models and get simple insights, and you get all of the insights you say from the models in my book with David. And I think you know that's right. And there's great merit to having simple tractable models and models that you can simulate in a simple way for insight. And that's exactly one of the tools that's used in monetary policy committees of central banks. I know they are. They tell me they use them. But that's a different question from being able to do research on much more complicated and questions that require, or that for which you would like quantitative answers. And the whole range of work now that's being done in the Hank tradition has many of the same mechanisms, but they're answering. For example, there are papers on firm dynamics, for example, using lots of microdata, showing what is happening in terms of that's an example of actually bringing in some of these growth questions into the macro model, which they can do. So that I think that it's just a much richer field for asking questions that I can do a simple analysis using my 3-equation model and blah blah blah, and I can give you qualitative things. But I
include your firm dynamics based on the simple framework.
Yes, but I can't.
Hank model any better.
Yes, because it can be used for it can be taken to the data, it can be tested against using data in a very creative way, and I think you can. So there's interesting work comparing, applying a Hank model with firm dynamics to the French context and comparing that to the US context, for example, right? That was just the domain of applied micro in the past. But macro models can look at the general equilibrium implications of a whole lot of very interesting questions that were not possible before. And I think it's that marrying of the general equilibrium analysis, which is what you can do with the Hank-type model, and what you can do with a simple model. But what you can't do with a simple model are these data-based exercises. So I think, we can make progress, and they're not in conflict with each other. Yeah.
Yeah, in the part of your talk where you were mentioning that how the transmission of business cycles came to be understood as not being due to intertemporal substitution, you mentioned somewhat in passing asset prices. And I'm curious what you think are the appropriate policies, monetary, fiscal, or other, to deal with the possibility of asset bubbles and how that fits into this whole story. Yeah.
So there's another strand that I didn't talk about, which also came out of the financial crisis, which is the kind of macro finance strand, the work of people like Atif Mian. And I think, and there are now some people kind of joining together these two strands, so that in the Hank model they're now talking about using these kind of S-shaped models, multiple equilibrium models, based on the leverage mechanisms that have been developed by Hyun Shin, Mian, and so on. So I think, and again, there are simple-minded versions of that in my book, but the fact that these things are really on the table and are being studied by PhD students is what gives me confidence that we're going to get good. Or to put it another way, unless you're asking the right, interesting questions, you're not going to get good, useful research. And for decades, in macro, in most departments, the right questions were not being asked because everything had to hinge on this intertemporal optimization channel. And that was never going to give you the answer to an interesting question. Yeah, Aaron.
Oh, yeah. So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about where you see the role of, I guess, sort of computational power
Yeah.
and sort of theory making, interacting. And here's my starting point.
Mm-hmm.
I think if we had sort of like amazing compute capabilities in 1985 or 1990, I don't think we would have actually learned something very interesting about the world. I don't think that was actually the constraint, even though that was thought to be at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Is it the case that today, partially through the Hink model, maybe changing, maybe like marrying parts of agent-based modeling with reinforcement learning and expectation formation, as well as really rich, sort of description of market structures, et cetera, is something that's just a lot more realistic, that actually can make quantitative predictions that are just sort of like qualitatively different than what most economic models have done. Is that really possible, or is that Panglossian?
No, I think that there are possibilities, but there has to be progress made on, especially on the expectations front. And I think what's interesting is that those who made some of these real breakthroughs in being able to compute these Hank models are now the ones that are saying, and there's a lot more computing power available, are saying this is the wrong thing to do in terms of the way we were modeling expectations. So it's not a constraint by being imposed by the compute power. So I think it's a really interesting kind of, they're the ones that figured out how to do it, and then they've realized, this is just not a good idea, no matter how much power we had. So we should be deploying it in a different way along the lines that you're suggesting. And I think there's a lot of experimentation going on. But the macro aspect of it is the general equilibrium aspect. And that's where I think the response to Peter is that that you need, whether you call them Hank or not, there's probably a better name for it, but there is a place for these quantitative laboratories to find things out that we can't do simply with qualitative models of the kind in my book. Yeah.
Wendy, so nice to see you again. So in your new framework, from demand side, you're gonna use a Hank model. But according to Hank model, the inequality is basically based on the individual level, the difference of the amount of wealth and the characteristic of those wealth. But as for supply side, the inequality, I think, is mostly based on the class conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you combine these different aspects of inequality inside one single framework?
Yeah, so that's, but I agree that that makes it challenging, because you've got to identify, so in terms of households, you've got workers, so workers are also consumers, and the owners are owners. Owners are owners and employers, so they own wealth. And I think taking this to the data is challenging, and it's again going to be another step, because it requires putting together what is now really models that are used in labour with macro models. But people are beginning to think about this, and you obviously always have to make compromises when you're deciding, you're making your decisions in modelling, and it depends very often on the question that you're most focused on. And I think, their response to what I've been saying will be so far, when we looked at the financial crisis, our big problem was how could we get decent sized multipliers. So we legitimately focus on the demand side, and that's right. But now they've been confronted with inflation, and they had to kind of think, oh dear, right? So, and supply shocks. So that's what's been pushing them more to take more seriously how to model the supply side. Jerry.
Thanks, Wendy. So this is a fascinating tour of the history of macro and micro. So one of the things in this story that seems kind of ironic to me is that this change in paradigm was prompted by, according to your argument, the financial crisis, in response to the financial crisis. But the response has been, you said, this general equilibrium imposition in this individual agent model. But the problem with general equilibrium theory is it's never really been able to incorporate what you understand. There's never been able to incorporate the financial sector, money and finance. There's never been a coherent way to do that. So isn't there a kind of divergence between the apparent motivation for changing the paradigm, but the ability to actually incorporate these financial problems in that paradigm?
Yes, I think that it's pretty much limited to thinking about balance sheets, right? So incorporating credit constraints. So you could say it's more about trying to understand the Great Recession than the causes of the financial crisis. I would say that's more, if you were to say what was more salient in terms of the pressure on macros, was how can we explain why we're stuck in this Great Recession? Well, it's clearly not because of the twisting of the Euler equation, right? And so the body of work on developing really good, making really good progress on financial cycles, I think has happened in a different part of really this macro finance part of macro, which was never brought into real business cycles. So that was just a different, just like international macro has never been part of the real business cycle macro. So the people around Atif Mian, Brunemeyer, those kind of finance people who've been working on financial cycles, the people at the BIS, that's where I see the more interesting work taking place there. Yeah, I don't think anyone is pretending to marry a model. I mean, we tried in a sort of limited way, in a kind of simple way in the book, in the previous, the 2015 book, to show how you could incorporate financial cycles into the structure of the macro model, but not in these Hank models, no. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Wendy. Very interesting presentation. My question is about whether this inequality revolution in macro will lead to a revolution in macro policy. And in particular, you said that you were, let's say, against modifying the objectives of monetary policy, even though Hank models conclude that stabilization role is very limited compared to the insured or the insurance effect. And what is your view on this? And because it seems to me that according to these Hank models, monetary policy doesn't have really very important effect like stabilizing inflation, whereas it can have an impact on inequality and other things. So then there are roles for changing monetary policy the way we central banks use it.
Yeah, so this I can sort of sense that we could veer into the territory of MMT here, which I don't particularly want to, but my own view, and it's not particularly I'm not saying it's that well founded, but my own view is that a key role in the economy is to establish the nominal anchor. And what that means is that somehow the rate of inflation, so the real economy can go on with any particular constant rate of inflation. So somehow we think that a reasonably low inflation rate promotes a better functioning of the economy. And how is that determined? Well, in an economy with a flexible exchange rate and an inflation targeting bank, it's established by the announcement by the central bank of its inflation target. That is the nominal anchor. So I believe that is a very important role played by monetary policy. And so then the question is, okay, words are words, and how is that actually kind of instantiated in the world? Well, it isn't, because everyone has rational expectations and jumps onto the perfect foresight path and ensures that the economy moves towards the inflation target. It doesn't. And as we've seen in the last few years, in some countries, it's really interesting. There's a lot of cross-country variation in what's happened with inflation following the post-COVID and the Ukraine spike in inflation. So some countries have found it really hard, like the UK, to get inflation back down towards the inflation target. Other countries have done that. In the ECB, for example, has got inflation back down to target. But again, they've done it through the trick of because they're the weighted average of inflation in very different countries. So some countries are still really quite a bit above and others are below. But I think, yes, the nominal anchor target is really, the nominal anchor role is really crucial. And I don't think the central bank is well placed to have targets for inequality. That should be the role of fiscal policy, in my view, because I think they have the instruments. I don't think monetary policy has good instruments for delivering on inequality outcomes. Although I do think there are interesting questions about central bank digital currency and the role of digital currency in a crisis. But that I would see as a combined fiscal and monetary policy tool, not just monetary policy. Nancy.
So, with appreciation for what I've learned from your lecture, I just want to say that for someone like me that's coming from a tradition of feminist and ecological economics, this doesn't seem like a revolution at all. It seems like a very market-centric analysis that's basically setting aside the non-market economy or non-market assets. And I think it's missing an opportunity to look at how hints of that approach were apparent in what Arrow had to say, what you cited from Arrow, very profound observation that you have to look beyond the market. But it's also in Samuelson in his overlapping generations model, where he says the market cannot solve the problem of intergenerational transfers. So it just gives me I have a very different take on this intellectual history. And, yes, some micro really moved in a heterodox tradition, but also a lot of it moved into an analysis of the family and basically treated it just like a market. And that counter-revolution in economics kind of revitalized neoclassical thinking and it created, kind of set back the trends that you're talking about, on the kind of micro level. And I feel like what we end up with in this analysis of inequality is this attention to capital-labor conflict, which, yes, is really important, profits and wages. but there's nothing in here that gives us leverage on gender conflict or on racial conflict or on international conflict. And these are dimensions of collective negotiation and bargaining that are really dominating our current political environment.
No, I absolutely agree. I guess my response is, there has to be some division of labor, and I can't do everything. I think I've covered a lot of ground, and I'm absolutely, there's a load of things that are not included here, and in a constructive spirit, I would say that, again, looking through these postdoc applications, there are a lot of them which are absolutely of the kind that you're suggesting. They're not in macro, but there's our current postdoc, for example, her work is on intimate partner violence, and it's extraordinarily interesting and high quality work. So if you look at the list of topics, then I think you should be very optimistic. It's not in macro, but then not everything is in macro. And a lot of stuff I do is not in macro. I just thought there was something moderately interesting to say that would connect, this long sweep of history with Sam's contribution, which was and others from a sort of micro tradition that could be seen as bringing together this world of micro and macro, but it absolutely doesn't cover everything. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Very interesting to see a broad view of the evolution of macroeconomics, and I would like to focus on one division of the building approach, which is inside macro, this common division between the cycle and growth. And I would like to hear what you think about how these developments of introducing inequality to the analysis of the cycle are actually linked or can be linked to a more broad understanding of the forces of capital accumulation, which since the very beginning, and I'm thinking, for instance, of Lewis' paper on limited supplies of labor, that has a theory of economy, of income distribution, which is not highlighted always when that paper is taught, but that has been always at the core of growth and more broadly circular change. So
it's a great question, and sort of the irony is that the whole real business cycle, deviation was all about unifying the growth and the cycle. It was just like an incredibly narrow way of thinking, Ramsey model plus shocks, right? So that was, and the amount of kind of intellectual firepower that absorbed is pretty scandalous. When I think of it's clearly unsatisfactory to have a separation between your model of inequality and growth, but I think in the core project we've tried to address this to an extent. So we have a new chapter, a new unit in the macro volume, which was just published last month, and it's called Uneven Development. And there we try to at least give the students a sense of how they can use what they've seen in the business cycle type modeling, and bring that together with this real question of the drivers of capital accumulation. It doesn't deal with Nancy's problem very well, but it tries to address why some countries have been able to achieve several decades of rapid growth and others have not. Using this similar kind of way of thinking in terms of what the kind of principal conflicts are within the economy. So have a look at that, and it may provide some suggestion. But it's a kind of Schumpeterian approach.
for a fascinating presentation. And as Melania announced, we have a reception downstairs, so we'll see you down there.
Thank you.
That was great. Is the natural rate stuff dead also?
No. No, but it's not a natural rate. There's never anything natural.